You saved me without even realizing it. It was tough to hear, bittersweet knowing that Chris had to endure so much hardship to get here, but it was also beautiful. He had finally found himself rebuilding his life step by step, and for the first time, he was owning it. He wasn't asking anyone else to do it for him. Amy, always the one to lighten the mood, smiled and joked, "Well, Hannah, you definitely deserve a medal for dealing with him." We all laughed, and the tension that once surrounded our relationship with Chris disappeared, replaced by a lighthearted moment of shared understanding. It was a good feeling, one that made the difficult times feel worthwhile. As the evening drew to a close, Hannah pulled us aside before we left. "I just want to thank you both," she said, looking sincere. "Chris is a completely different person now. You gave him back to his kids, and they're so lucky to have him." It was hard to process everything in that moment. We had done what we thought was best for us, and now here we were, witnessing the incredible change in Chris's life. We hadn't aimed to be heroes. We just wanted to live our lives. But by setting boundaries and standing firm, we had given Chris and his kids a chance. It was something I never thought I'd say, but I couldn't help feeling grateful that things had turned out this way. As we left dinner that night, Amy and I talked about how far Chris had come. It wasn't just that he had found someone new, but how he had gradually rebuilt his life with help, but without relying on anyone else to carry his responsibilities. Chris continued to flourish. He and Hannah appeared happy, and the kids were thriving. I am 34 years old and married to my wife, Amy, who is 32. I have a good job that allows us to live comfortably. We've always enjoyed a quiet, peaceful life. No kids, just the two of us traveling, working, and occasionally visiting family. However, everything changed when my 36-year-old brother, Chris, began to unravel. Chris has always been somewhat troubled. Growing up, he struggled to get his life together, making poor choices, failing to maintain steady employment, frequently asking for help, and generally not contributing much. It wasn't that we didn't care about him, but it became evident that he often depended on the family to rescue him whenever things went wrong. He wasn't a bad person, but he never seemed to figure life out. Things took a turn for the worse when Chris's wife passed away 2 years ago. They had been married for over 10 years, and her loss devastated Chris. It wasn't easy for any of us, but it completely crushed him. He began spiraling further out of control, and his three children, aged 10, 8, and 5, became his sole responsibility, a role he wasn't prepared for. The stress was evident as he struggled to manage work, finances, and raising his kids alone. Initially, Chris would drop hints about his difficulties, casually mentioning how hard it was to handle everything. He often laughed it off, making it seem like he was just venting. I didn't take him seriously. He was always complaining about something, and I didn't see it as my problem. Amy and I had always agreed that we didn't want children. From the start, we decided to focus on our careers, enjoy traveling, and avoid the challenges of raising kids. This was a lifestyle choice we had both embraced. As Chris's financial issues worsened, I reluctantly helped him out on several occasions. He would call in a panic, asking for money to cover bills or buy essentials for the kids. I sent what I could, but the requests became frequent. Eventually, I started feeling like an ATM. One evening, Chris showed up at our house unexpectedly while Amy and I were having dinner. He sat down and immediately began venting about his struggles. Work, the kids, bills, and how hard it was being a single parent. Hours passed as he poured out his frustrations. I suggested he try therapy or join a support group, but he dismissed the idea, saying I didn't understand what he was going through. During dinner, out of the blue, Chris remarked, "You and Amy would make great parents, if anything happened to me." Though it wasn't said in a joking manner, I assumed he was trying to lighten the mood. Amy and I exchanged awkward glances, but didn't respond. I chalked it up to Chris being himself. A few days later, he approached us more seriously, asking outright if we would take care of his kids if something happened to him. He confessed he didn't know how much longer he could manage. I was stunned. Raising 3 children was completely outside of our plans. I tried to explain that we weren't in a position to take on that responsibility and had no desire to raise children. Chris didn't take it well. He accused me of being selfish and said families should help each other. He suggested my life was easy because I didn't have kids and implied that Amy and I were prioritizing ourselves over his family. The tension rose, but I stood my ground. Amy intervened, stating firmly that we couldn't make such a life-altering decision without serious consideration. Chris wasn't interested in hearing it, storming off and calling us selfish for abandoning him and his kids. After he left, I felt overwhelmed. To make matters worse, my parents started pressuring me subtly, saying things like, "You're his brother. You need to support him." They didn't understand that I wasn't willing to upend my life because Chris couldn't manage his responsibilities. That night, Amy and I discussed the situation. She emphasized the need to set firm boundaries with both Chris and the rest of the family to avoid being guilt-tripped into something we weren't ready for. I could feel the weight of the situation, but I knew we had to prioritize our own lives. Update. After our conversation with Chris, the situation escalated quickly. He didn't take our refusal lightly, and I soon found myself in the middle of a storm I hadn't anticipated. It began with sporadic texts. Chris would send messages about how difficult his life was, how the kids were upset, how he struggled to balance everything, and how much they needed stability. I tried ignoring the messages, but they became more frequent, and it was clear he wasn't going to drop the issue. The next morning, my phone was inundated with messages from Chris pleading with me to reconsider. He said things like, "The kids love you and Amy, they'd be so happy with you," and repeatedly emphasized their need for stability. It felt less like a plea for help and more like an attempt to guilt me into agreeing. When I didn't respond, Chris escalated further by calling our parents, accusing me of abandoning his children. My parents quickly called me, urging me to reconsider and reminding me of my family duty. The pressure was mounting, and I felt cornered. Amy, seeing how much the situation was affecting me, was equally frustrated. We had already made our decision, yet it felt like no one was willing to respect it. Chris's attempts to manipulate me emotionally were relentless, and Amy kept reminding me that we had to stay strong. She pointed out that this wasn't just about me anymore. It affected us both as a couple. I knew she was right. Then, one afternoon, something unexpected happened. Chris showed up at my office without warning. I glanced up from my desk, and there he was, standing in the doorway. He walked in without knocking, and before I could say a word, he started talking. He didn't bother sitting down, diving straight into his appeal. Chris launched into an emotional plea, emphasizing how much his kids needed someone to care for them. He stressed that Amy and I would be great for them, mentioning how they didn't deserve to go through this turmoil. He explained that he was doing everything he could, but that it simply wasn't enough. His repeated argument was that the kids needed stability, which he claimed Amy and I could provide. At that moment, I lost my patience. I stood up, looked him in the eye, and said firmly, "You can't shove your responsibilities onto me. We don't want this life." My words came out sharper than I had intended, but I was fed up. It wasn't our problem. It wasn't something we had agreed to, and I wasn't about to let him force it on us. His expression fell, but he refused to back down. Suddenly, Chris broke down right there in the office lobby. He started crying, not just a few tears, but an intense emotional outburst like a dramatic scene from a movie. Coworkers began to notice, and I could feel their eyes on me. The situation was so public, so overwhelming, that I didn't know how to respond. Despite feeling guilty, I turned and walked away. I wasn't being heartless, but I wasn't going to give in to his demands. It felt like the only choice I had. I left him there, sobbing, and went straight home. Later that evening, Amy got a call from my parents. They were furious about what had happened. They accused me of humiliating Chris in front of everyone, insisting that I was being too harsh and that he was just struggling. My mom even told Amy that she was disappointed in me, saying I was turning my back on family. It was a lot to take in, and the pressure felt endless. But Amy had reached her limit. She decided it was time to address everything directly and set the record straight. She organized a family meeting for the upcoming weekend. It would just be me, Amy, Chris, and our parents. The goal was to clear the air and make our position unambiguously clear. When the meeting began, things went downhill quickly. Chris started by accusing us of letting his children suffer. He tried to guilt me again, claiming we were choosing an easy life while his kids endured hardship. It felt like we were stuck in a cycle. This time, however, Amy wasn't holding back. She told Chris in front of everyone, "Raising kids isn't something you force on others. It's a choice." She called out his history of financial instability and his tendency to avoid taking responsibility. She made it clear that it was unfair to expect us to clean up the mess he had created. Chris didn't take her words well. He stood up, slammed his hand on the table, and stormed out yelling that we didn't understand what it meant to love someone more than ourselves. That was the last thing he said before leaving, and we didn't hear from him for a while after that. The meeting ended without any resolution, but Amy and I felt confident we had done the right thing. We had set boundaries, and now it was up to Chris to figure out his next steps. Update. A few weeks passed since the family meeting, and the situation with Chris only worsened. After that confrontation, he completely cut off contact with Amy and me. No calls, no texts, nothing. For the first time, I felt a sense of relief, like there might finally be some peace. Amy and I returned to our usual routine, focusing on work and getting a bit more time for ourselves. But the tension lingered, a constant reminder of everything that had happened. I couldn't help but question whether I'd been too harsh. I had told him no, but was it wrong to refuse when his children were involved? Amy reassured me we had made the right decision. She believed firmly that we couldn't allow ourselves to be dragged into this situation, no matter how dire things seemed. Even so, guilt nagged at me. Was I being a bad brother? Should I have done more to help him? A few days after Chris stopped reaching out, my parents called me. They said Chris was considering giving up custody of the kids because he couldn't handle it anymore. The idea of them possibly ending up in foster care didn't sit well with me. I knew I couldn't ignore it, so I decided to call Chris. I needed to understand the situation and see if there was any way to assist without taking on custody. I offered to help him find resources, money for therapy, a parenting coach, or even financial support for childcare services. It was the only help I felt I could give without completely upending our lives. Chris's response was immediate and sharp. He accused me of being selfish, saying I was refusing to step up when I was his last option. He argued that if I wouldn't take the kids, I should at least help him keep them. His tone was angry, and the call ended with him shouting at me for abandoning him and the children before hanging up. That night, Amy called my parents again. She reiterated our position, making it clear that we were not changing our stance. We weren't going to take custody of Chris's kids, and we needed them to stop pressuring us. She laid it out plainly. No means no. Amy refused to let them guilt us into something we weren't ready or willing to handle. Unsurprisingly, my parents weren't pleased. They expressed disappointment and implied they would continue supporting Chris and fighting for his children's well-being, even if it meant doing so without us. It felt like they were once again letting him avoid taking responsibility. I had a sinking feeling that this situation wasn't going to resolve anytime soon. Then things took another turn for the worse. Chris began telling our extended family that Amy and I hated his kids and didn't care about them at all. The phone started ringing nonstop with relatives calling to ask why we were refusing to help family. Every conversation felt like I was explaining myself repeatedly, trying to set the record straight, and it was exhausting. Amy decided it was time to put an end to the rumors and confusion. She called a family meeting, inviting Chris, our parents, and the extended family. She was done letting Chris control the narrative, and we needed to make our position clear to everyone. We couldn't keep having these conversations over the phone, so it was time for everyone to hear it directly from us. The meeting didn't go as I anticipated. Chris entered with a defensive expression, his arms crossed, clearly preparing for a confrontation. Without wasting time, he accused Amy and me of abandoning him and his kids. "You're just letting them suffer," he said. "You could make their lives better, but you're too selfish to even try." Amy didn't hesitate. She stood up, took a deep breath, and calmly said, "We will not raise these kids. It's a huge responsibility, and it's not ours to take. Chris needs real help, not a scapegoat." Chris's face turned bright red, and he started shouting. saying that no one cared about him or the kids. He claimed everyone had abandoned him and that we were making his situation worse. Once again, he broke down in tears, his face wet with sobs. It was the same performance as before, and I could see through the manipulation. Amy remained resolute. Caring isn't enabling, she said firmly. You need to take charge of your life for your kids. We can't do this for you. We repeated our boundaries one more time. No means no. We couldn't keep going in circles with him. The conversation was over. From there, things began to divide within the family. Some relatives understood our perspective, agreeing that Chris needed to take responsibility for his own life and his kids. However, others were furious, calling us selfish and accusing us of abandoning Chris when he needed us most. I felt drained. I didn't want to lose family over this, but I also couldn't keep letting them push us into something we didn't want. It felt like every decision we made only caused more chaos, and I was tired of fighting on every front. Still, Amy and I both knew we had to stand our ground. We had made our choice, and no matter how much pressure they applied, nothing was going to change it. I walked away from that meeting feeling a mix of exhaustion and relief. The boundaries had been set, and we had said everything we needed to say. Chris's actions had brought us here, and now it was his responsibility to figure out what came next. Update: a few weeks after the family meeting, things seemed to calm down. The drama surrounding Chris had quieted, and Amy and I were starting to feel like we could breathe again. But that peace didn't last long. One afternoon, I received a call from my mom. Her voice was trembling as she told me that Chris had been admitted to the hospital due to some kind of health scare, and no one knew exactly what had happened. She was worried and said it was serious. I wasn't sure how to react. Chris had always seemed emotionally unwell. But hearing that something physical had occurred made me realize just how far he had fallen. Without hesitation, I grabbed my keys and drove straight to the hospital. When I arrived, Chris was in a small room, hooked up to IVs, looking drained. He wasn't in great condition, but he was awake. The doctor told me it was likely the stress from everything happening in his life that had caused this episode. He had been neglecting his health for so long that it had finally caught up with him. When Chris saw me, he gave me a faint smile, but it didn't feel right. He looked pale, his eyes swollen from crying, and it was obvious he was at his breaking point. Almost immediately, he began speaking, his voice trembling. I can't keep doing this, he admitted. I don't know how to keep going. I feel like I'm failing every day. I'm so tired. I can't be everything for them anymore. I knew this was a turning point, but I couldn't let myself get swept up in the emotion. I sat down beside him and listened. I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the toll it had all taken on him. After a while, I gently reminded him that we still couldn't raise his kids. I reiterated our boundary, our decision hadn't changed, but I also offered help in finding the resources he needed. We won't raise your kids, Chris, but we can help you get the support you need. At first, he didn't respond. He just stared at me, trying to process what I had said. After a few moments, he nodded, reluctantly muttering, I'll do it. I'll meet with a counselor or anyone who can help me. That was a small win, but it was a beginning. Over the next few weeks, I assisted him in taking the first steps. We found a family counselor who could help him work through his emotions and the overwhelming responsibility of being a single parent. I also helped him find a parenting coach, someone who could assist him with the practical aspects like discipline, time management, and addressing his kids' needs. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Meanwhile, Amy stepped in to handle other areas. She helped Chris apply for state aid and childcare services, and we researched resources specifically for widowed single parents. Amy was amazing. She researched, made calls, and found programs that would help Chris get back on his feet. It was a team effort, but Chris was beginning to realize that solutions were out there. Gradually, Chris began to implement the support he needed. He started attending therapy regularly and meeting with the parenting coach. I could notice changes in him, small at first, but still noticeable. He seemed less overwhelmed and started managing his time better. The stress didn't seem as suffocating as before. It was now clear that Chris never intended to abandon his kids. He wasn't a bad person. He had simply been completely overwhelmed, drowning under the weight of it all. The issue wasn't that he didn't care, it was that he couldn't handle everything on his own. A few weeks after all of this began, Chris called me. His voice was different this time, calmer, more composed. He apologized for everything. I was unfair to you and Amy. I pushed too hard and I shouldn't have. You guys were right to set boundaries. I was out of line, he said. It was a big step for him, and I appreciated it. The wounds weren't completely healed, but they were beginning to mend. I could tell he was trying to make things right, and it felt like the tension between us was finally easing. Around that same time, Chris's kids sent Amy and me thank you cards. They didn't know the full story, of course, but it was a kind gesture. The cards were filled with drawings and little notes expressing their gratitude for everything we had done for them. I couldn't help but smile, even though I knew the real work for Chris was still ahead. I still felt bittersweet about the situation. The fact that it had taken a health scare for Chris to start seeking the help he needed made me conflicted. On one hand, I was glad he was taking responsibility for his life, but on the other hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that it shouldn't have taken all of this to get to this point. My parents also began to soften. They called to admit that pushing the custody issue on us was unfair. They didn't exactly apologize, but they acknowledged we had made the right choice. However, they still expressed disappointment that Chris couldn't get his life together on his own. And it was hard not to hear the lingering judgment in their voices. In the end, though, Chris seemed to be on the right path. He set new goals for himself, ones focused on becoming a healthier, more stable parent. He still had a long way to go, but the changes were real. His kids were doing better, and Chris was starting to realize he didn't have to do everything on his own. It wouldn't be easy, but he was finally taking control of his life, and I was proud of him for that. We weren't completely out of the woods yet, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like we were moving in the right direction. Just when it seemed like things were finally settling down with Chris, I received a message from my parents that completely shocked me. Chris was thinking about moving to another state for a fresh start. I stared at my phone for a moment, trying to process what I had just read. Moving? After everything that had happened? I didn't know what to think. Was this really the right time for him to make such a drastic decision? I called him right away. The conversation began with a strange mix of tension and confusion. Why are you thinking of moving? I asked. Things were starting to improve for you. What's going on? Chris's voice on the other end sounded strained, like he had rehearsed his words. Look, I know I've been doing better, but I just feel like everyone's judging me. I can't escape it. I need a clean slate. I need to be somewhere I can focus on my kids without all the pressure from family, he explained. He mentioned he was considering moving to a city with better job opportunities, a lower cost of living, and a chance to leave the past behind. It sounded like the typical impulsive decision he used to make, but this time it felt different. Chris had made progress in his life, and now he was talking about uprooting everything once again. The idea of him taking the kids and moving away so suddenly made me uneasy. It felt too quick, too impulsive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't thinking it through. What about his support system here? He had just started to find stability, and now he was ready to throw it all away. Amy overheard me talking on the phone and spoke up as soon as I hung up. He's rushing into something again, isn't he? She said, crossing her arms. He's acting like moving is going to fix everything, just like he always does. She was right. It felt like Chris was repeating his old pattern of making impulsive decisions without considering the long-term consequences. That's when I realized I needed to step in again, not to control his choices, but to help him think this through. I scheduled to meet Chris for dinner the following day. We sat down at a small restaurant, and Chris started explaining his reasoning. He talked about the job opportunities in the new city, how the cost of living would be more affordable, and how he believed starting over would offer him a new outlook on life. I understand, I interrupted, but have you really considered how this will affect the kids? They're just starting to adjust. Are you sure this is best for them? Or are you simply running away from everything that's been holding you back? Chris stiffened. It's not like that, he snapped defensively. I just need a fresh start. I can't keep living in the past. But what about the kids? I pressed. They have friends, school, their entire life here. You need to think about how this will impact them too. Chris paused, clearly uncomfortable with the question. I don't know. I haven't thought about that, but I know they'll adjust. Have you really thought it through? I asked again, trying to help him see the bigger picture. You can't just make snap decisions. Moving is a huge change for everyone, especially the kids. Are you ready for all of that? Amy, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. Chris, why not take a few months to plan it carefully? You're rushing into something that could be a big mistake. Moving won't fix everything. You've been making progress here, and I think you need to take the time to make sure it's the right choice. Chris didn't answer immediately. I could see him weighing it, the seriousness of the decision starting to sink in. Maybe you're right, he said, finally, though I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. He agreed to meet with a therapist again to help clarify his motivations. He also said he would consult with a financial advisor before making any final decisions. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. In the meantime, my parents called to voice their concerns. They were worried that if Chris didn't move soon, he'd slip back into his old habits. They even hinted they'd be willing to help him financially if he stayed nearby, which only frustrated me. It felt like they were trying to rescue him again, and I couldn't stand it. I finally told them, gently but firmly, that they needed to stop rescuing Chris every time he struggled. He's making progress on his own, I explained. You can't just swoop in every time he's having a hard time. Let him handle this on his own. Chris kept me informed over the next few weeks. He worked with his counselor to make sure his decision to move wasn't driven by an impulse to escape responsibility. He applied for jobs in nearby cities, focusing on stability rather than upheaval. Eventually, he decided to put the move off entirely. He realized what he truly needed wasn't an escape, but to build a more stable life where he was. He continued working on himself, making steady progress. His kids were doing better in school, making new friends, and things were starting to settle into a routine. One evening, Chris called me, sounding calmer than I had ever heard him. I never realized how much I was avoiding facing my problems until you forced me to, he admitted. You were right. I've been running away from everything, but now I'm finally dealing with it. I couldn't help but feel proud of him. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't a perfect solution, but Chris had made the right decision for himself and his kids. Looking back, I realized that setting boundaries wasn't just about protecting our own lives. It was about helping Chris take control of his own. In the end, it strengthened our relationship. He wasn't the same person who had once tried to push all his burdens onto us. He was becoming someone who could stand on his own. And for that, I was grateful. A year had passed since everything started to fall into place. Life had finally settled into a new normal, one that felt comfortable for both Amy and me. Chris had remained steady. He was working a better job, attending therapy regularly, and gradually becoming the person I had always hoped he could be. It was clear that he had learned to manage the responsibilities of fatherhood without relying on us to fix everything. His kids were happy and well-adjusted, and Chris seemed more confident than I had ever seen him. It wasn't perfect, but it was a huge improvement from where we had been. Amy and I would occasionally talk about how things had changed. It hadn't always been easy, but we both knew we had played a role in encouraging Chris to take responsibility for his own life. We were proud of him, not because we had done everything for him, but because we had set the boundaries that ultimately helped him grow. We hadn't sacrificed our values for his sake, and that meant everything to us. Then, one day, Chris invited us to dinner. It seemed like a simple, casual family gathering, nothing out of the ordinary. I figured it was just an excuse to spend some time together. Little did I know, he had a surprise planned. When we arrived, Chris and the kids were already there. It was a cozy setting, with the kids happily chattering away, and everything felt relaxed. We sat down for dinner, and Chris seemed a bit more excited than usual. He smiled at us across the table, but there was something else in his eyes, a nervous anticipation. After a few minutes, Chris took a deep breath and made an announcement that caught both Amy and me by surprise. He said he had met someone new, a woman named Hannah. She was a teacher Chris had met through the kids' school activities. As he spoke, Hannah entered the room. The kids instantly lit up and ran toward her, eagerly introducing her as Dad's friend who helps with homework and soccer practice. It was clear they had already accepted her as part of their lives. Chris continued, explaining that he and Hannah had been seeing each other for several months, but had kept it private until they were certain their relationship was serious. It was one of those moments when you realize everything has changed. Chris wasn't just managing anymore, he was flourishing, and his life was expanding in ways I never imagined. Then Hannah spoke, and the room grew silent. She shared how impressed she was with Chris's parenting and the growth she had witnessed in him. With a gentle smile, she added something that completely caught me off guard. Chris talks often about how you two saved him when he couldn't see a way out. You gave him the push he needed to turn his life around. Amy and I exchanged glances, stunned. We hadn't realized how deeply our tough love had affected Chris until Hannah said that. She was right, though. We had pushed him, but we never expected him to reach this point. Hearing him talk about a new relationship and a future with stability was more than I ever thought possible for him. Chris became emotional at that moment. Looking at both of us, his voice cracked slightly. I don't know where I'd be without you two, he said. Thank you for pushing me to grow and not carrying my burdens.